The diner was busy that afternoon, filled with the sound of chatter, clinking dishes, and country music playing softly in the background. The smell of fried chicken and coffee floated through the air. People were laughing, joking, and eating like every normal day. Then the door opened and Officer Carl walked in, wearing his police uniform and his usual proud look. Everyone noticed him. He was known in town, strong, loud, always acting like he owned the place. Some people respected him because he wore a badge, others feared him because of his temper. In the corner of the diner, a new man sat quietly by himself. He was tall, calm, and well-mannered. He had dark skin and neat clothes, not too fancy, but clean and simple. He didn't talk to anyone, just ate slowly and minded his own business. The waitress smiled at him once, and he nodded politely. Nobody really knew who he was, but everyone could tell he wasn't from around there. Carl looked at him with a smirk. "New guy in town?" he said loud enough for people to hear. The man lifted his eyes, met Carl's gaze for a second, then went back to eating. He didn't answer. That made Carl angry. He didn't like being ignored, especially by someone he thought was beneath him. He walked closer, pretending to joke. "Hey, when someone talks to you, you answer, understand?" Still no reply. The room grew quieter. A few people stopped eating, waiting to see what would happen. The waitress whispered, "Leave him alone, Carl, he's not bothering anyone." But Carl just laughed. "Relax, I'm only having some fun." He looked down at the man's plate, hot stew with bread and salad. In a single quick move, Carl picked up the bowl of food and poured it right over the man's head. The thick stew ran down his face and onto his shirt. The diner gasped. Some people covered their mouths. Others laughed nervously. Carl crossed his arms, smiling like he had won something. "Welcome to the city," he said mockingly. The man didn't move for a moment. He just sat there, dripping, his hands shaking slightly, but not from fear, from control. Slowly, he wiped his face with a napkin, stood up, and looked Carl straight in the eyes. The room went silent. His eyes were calm, deep and cold, not angry but focused, like someone who had seen worse. "Are you done?" the man asked softly. His voice was calm, steady, and strong. Carl blinked, not expecting him to talk like that. He laughed again, louder this time, trying to hide his unease. "You got a problem?" he barked. The man simply placed some cash on the table, exact change for his meal, and said, "You'll regret that." His tone was quiet but carried weight, like a warning. Then he turned and walked out the door. No one spoke for a long moment. The waitress looked at Carl with disappointment. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Carl shrugged. "Some people need to learn respect," he muttered, brushing his uniform as if nothing had happened. The laughter in the diner faded slowly. Everyone could still feel the tension hanging in the air. Outside, the man wiped his hair and shirt with a handkerchief and stood still beside his black car. He didn't look angry, just thoughtful, almost sad. He looked back at the diner for a second, then got in his car and drove away. Inside, Carl pretended to enjoy his coffee, but something about the man's calm eyes bothered him. There was something unusual about that guy, something he couldn't quite explain. A few of the locals whispered among themselves. "Did you see how he looked at him?" one man said. "Yeah, like he wasn't scared at all," another replied. "He's not from around here," the cook said. "But I don't think he's just some worker either." The waitress, wiping the counter, sighed. That man had discipline. You could see it. "I think Carl just messed with the wrong person." Carl laughed loudly to drown out their whispers. "You people are too soft. He's probably just another drifter." But inside, for the first time in a long while, Carl felt uneasy. He couldn't get that quiet stare out of his head. It wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of someone who knew something, someone who had power but didn't need to show it. As the sun set outside the diner windows, Carl sat back, staring at his reflection in the glass. He told himself it was just another random man, just another day. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had made a big mistake. Later that night, when he closed his eyes, he saw that same calm face again. The man standing tall, soaked in stew yet still silent and proud. The image wouldn't leave him. For the first time, Officer Carl, the man who thought he controlled the town, couldn't shake the feeling that he had just poured food on someone far more dangerous than he imagined. And outside the small town, driving through the dark road, the stranger finally smiled to himself quietly. He wasn't angry, He was patient. His work had just begun, and tomorrow the real lesson would start. The next morning, the story of what happened in the diner spread through the small town like wildfire. Everyone was talking about it, the bold new man, the food, the silence that followed. Some said the stranger was just too scared to fight back. Others said he was planning something big. Nobody really knew, but the way he looked at Officer Carl before walking out, that calm, powerful stare, kept everyone uneasy. Carl, on the other hand, walked around like nothing happened. He even joked about it at the police station. He should be thankful I didn't arrest him for attitude, he laughed to his partner. But even as he laughed, that quiet voice from the diner echoed in his head. You'll regret that. The waitress from the diner, named Mary, couldn't forget the scene either. She had seen anger before, but the look in that man's eyes was different, controlled, like he was watching something much bigger than the moment itself. Later that day, she found a small card on the table he sat at. It had fallen under the chair. It wasn't a credit card or ID. It was plain white with only 3 letters printed neatly in the center. FBI. She froze. Her hands trembled as she looked around. Could it be real? Maybe it was fake. Maybe he dropped it on purpose. But something told her it wasn't just an accident. She hid the card in her apron pocket and said nothing to anyone. Meanwhile, in the station, Carl received a call. The chief wanted everyone present for a meeting that afternoon. We've got federal eyes on us, the chief said over the phone. Apparently, there's been a complaint about officer conduct. Some people in suits are asking questions. Carl laughed again. They can come if they want. I've got nothing to hide. But deep down, that uneasy feeling returned. By lunchtime, Mary couldn't hold it in. She went to the police station, nervous but determined. She asked for Carl but found the chief instead. Quietly, she handed him the card. This was left behind by the man Officer Carl. Poured food on yesterday. The chief frowned, looking down at the card. His face turned pale. He looked up at her sharply. Are you sure about this? Mary nodded. Positive. The chief didn't waste time. He called in 2 other officers and checked the federal contact list in his system. When the name printed on the card came up, his jaw tightened. The man wasn't just some visitor. He was Special Agent Daniel Brooks, a top-level investigator assigned to inspect small-town law enforcement corruption cases across the state. The chief called Carl into his office immediately. Carl swaggered in, still carrying that lazy grin. What's up, boss? He said. The chief threw the card on the table. Recognize this? Carl picked it up, looked at it for a second, and shrugged. Just some fancy card. The chief's voice turned cold. That's not just some fancy card, Carl. That's the man you humiliated yesterday. For a moment, Carl didn't speak. The blood drained from his face. You're joking, he said. The chief glared. Does this look like a joke? You poured food on a federal agent, you idiot. The room went silent. Carl tried to laugh, but it came out weak. He didn't say anything. He didn't even stop me. The chief slammed his fist on the desk. Of course he didn't. He was watching you. He was undercover! Carl's legs suddenly felt heavy. He sat down, sweating. The chief rubbed his forehead. You might have just ended your career, Carl. Do you understand what this means? He could file charges, write a full report, maybe even have the Bureau open a federal case against us. Carl swallowed hard, his pride crumbling. What do I do now? The chief didn't answer right away. You do nothing. You stay quiet, you stay respectful, and if that man comes back, you apologize. You understand me? Outside the office, the whispers had already begun. Some officers had overheard parts of the conversation. Did you hear that? One whispered. That guy from the diner, he's FBI. Another said. Carl's done for. That evening, as the sun dipped low, a black SUV rolled into town. It parked outside the diner where it all began. The door opened and the same man stepped out, calm, dressed in a neat suit, carrying a folder under his arm. Mary, watching from inside, nearly dropped a cup when she saw him. He looked cleaner now, sharper, his expression unreadable. He walked inside, ordered a coffee, and sat at the same table. The diner went silent again, just like yesterday. The waitress approached, trying to hide her nervousness. You left this behind, she said, handing him the card. Daniel looked at it, smiled softly, and said, Thank you. Outside, 2 local officers noticed the SUV and called Carl immediately. He's here, they said. Carl felt a cold sweat run down his neck. He looked out the station window and saw the black vehicle. For the first time, his knees trembled. Carl didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. The laughter from the diner would soon turn into whispers of fear. Because tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. And this time, Officer Carl wouldn't be the one asking the questions. The next morning, the police station felt strangely quiet. Normally, the halls buzzed with laughter, gossip, and the sound of boots echoing on the tiled floor. But today, even the coffee machine seemed to hiss more softly. Officer Carl walked, and wearing his sunglasses, trying to act casual, but everyone knew he wasn't himself. Whispers followed him from desk to desk. He caught pieces of conversation. The diner, FBI, trouble. He clenched his jaw and pretended not to hear. He went straight to his desk, pretending to write a report. His hands, though, trembled slightly. He had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that calm face again, stew dripping down, quiet eyes staring into his soul. It wasn't just guilt that bothered him. It was the silence. The man hadn't shouted, hadn't cursed, hadn't even fought back. That silence was more frightening than a punch. Around mid-morning, the chief's door slammed open. Chief Daniels walked out holding a brown file with a red sticker on it. Confidential. His face was pale, serious. Everyone stopped talking. He looked around and said, "Carl, in my office now." Carl hesitated, then walked in, closing the door behind him. The chief didn't tell him to sit. He simply tossed the file onto the desk. "You remember that man from the diner?" he asked quietly. Carl nodded, unsure what to say. The chief opened the file slowly, showing the first page. Carl leaned forward and froze. There it was. The same face, same eyes, same quiet expression. But now it was printed neatly beside a name and a title. Special Agent Daniel Brooks, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Carl's mouth went dry. He took a small step back, almost tripping over the chair. This is a joke, right?" he whispered. The chief didn't laugh. "No joke," he said flatly. "He's been assigned to investigate cases of corruption and racial misconduct within small-town police departments across the state. And guess what, Carl? He picked our town first." Carl's face turned white. His stomach twisted. "You mean he's here for us?" The chief nodded. "He was already in town before you humiliated him. He was watching us now. He's watching you." Carl sank into the chair, his heart pounding. The chief continued, "He's already filed an initial report. The Bureau's sending a team tomorrow to begin interviews. He mentioned your name specifically." Carl buried his face in his hands. "God, what have I done?" The chief sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "You've done more than embarrass yourself. You've put this whole department under a microscope. Every file, every case, every arrest, you've opened the door for them to question everything we've done." Outside the office, the younger officers were trying not to listen, but curiosity was stronger than fear. They exchanged looks. One whispered, "He's really FBI?" The other nodded. "Yeah, Carl's finished." Meanwhile, Carl sat in silence, sweat running down his neck. The chief flipped another page in the file. "He's no ordinary agent," he said slowly. "He's known for exposing corrupt officers in 3 other towns. Each time he started by pretending to be a normal citizen, and each time the officers who disrespected him ended up behind bars or out of a job." Carl looked up, his voice shaking. "What can I do? Maybe I can talk to him, apologize." The chief cut him off. "Apologize? You dumped food on his head in front of witnesses, Carl. Do you think sorry will make that disappear?" For the first time in his life, Carl didn't have an answer. He felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt in uniform. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavier, almost burning. Just then, a knock came on the door. A young officer entered, holding a letter. "Sir, this was just delivered," he said nervously. The chief opened it, scanned the contents, and passed it to Carl. The letter was official, printed on FBI stationery. It said, "Federal inspection begins tomorrow, 9 a.m. Officer Carl Peters' conduct will be reviewed in relation to citizen harassment complaint. Signed, Special Agent Daniel Brooks. Carl's hands shook as he read it. The ink felt heavy on the page as if the words carried real weight. He looked at the chief, but the chief just said quietly, "You'd better pray he believes in second chances." Later that day, as Carl left the office, everyone avoided his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't the loudest man in the room. He felt like a ghost walking through his own department. When he got to his car, he sat inside for a long time, just staring at his reflection in the windshield. "FBI," he whispered. All this time, he was FBI. That evening, while driving home, Carl noticed a black SUV parked near the old diner. He slowed down. Through the window, he saw him, Agent Brooks, sitting alone, sipping coffee, reading something on a tablet. No bodyguards, no agents, just him, calm, focused. Carl gripped the steering wheel tighter. He thought about walking in, saying sorry, maybe begging for understanding. But fear froze him in place. Instead, he kept driving, heart pounding, knowing tomorrow would decide everything. His career, his future, maybe even his freedom. Inside the diner, Agent Brooks glanced up briefly as the police cruiser passed by. He watched the taillights fade into the distance, then smiled faintly. Lesson 1, he murmured to himself, is almost done. Outside, the night grew colder, and the town's quiet streets seemed to hold their breath. Because by morning the truth would step into the light, and Officer Carl would finally understand what real authority looked like. The morning sun rose slowly over the small town, but for the officers at the station, it brought no warmth. The air felt heavier than usual, filled with tension and quiet fear. A rumor had already spread. The FBI is coming today. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. This was because of Carl. Carl sat at his desk staring at the wall clock. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. He had polished his badge, ironed his uniform, and combed his hair 3 times, but none of it helped. His stomach was in knots. Every sound made him flinch. The ring of a phone, the slam of a locker, even the creak of a chair. At exactly 9 a.m., the sound of car engines broke the silence. Through the glass windows, black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. The doors opened one by one, and men in dark suits stepped out, calm and steady. The whole station froze. The agents didn't rush or shout. They moved like they owned the place. And behind them, walking with quiet confidence, was the man Carl had humiliated. Daniel Brooks. No longer wearing plain clothes, this time a clean gray suit, tie perfectly in place, and a small badge clipped to his belt. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes, those same eyes that had stared at Carl in the diner, now carried something sharper. Authority. The chief came out to greet them, forcing a smile. "Agent Brooks, welcome," he said carefully. Daniel nodded. "Thank you, Chief Daniels. We'll keep this quick and professional." His voice was low but firm, the kind of tone that made everyone listen without question. Carl sat frozen in his chair as the group entered the station. His heart pounded. He wanted to disappear. Every step Agent Brooks took echoed like thunder in his ears. When Daniel finally turned his head and looked directly at him, Carl's throat went dry. The agent said nothing, just met his eyes for a long, heavy second. Then he looked away and continued walking. That silence hurt more than any insult. The FBI team set up inside the meeting room. They opened laptops, spread files, and began talking to the chief. Papers were signed. Folders exchanged. No one could hear what they were saying, but the expressions on the officers' faces outside told the story. Something serious was happening. After nearly half an hour, the door opened. Daniel stepped out alone. His eyes scanned the room before stopping at Carl's desk. "Officer Carl Peters," he said calmly. "A word." Carl stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room on him. He followed Daniel into the office, his boots heavy on the floor. When the door closed, the silence was suffocating. Daniel stood near the window, his back turned. "You know," he began, I've met all kinds of people in my work. Criminals, liars, proud men with no conscience. But you—" He turned around. "You did something most of them wouldn't dare. You humiliated a stranger just because you could." Carl swallowed hard. I didn't know who you were." Daniel's voice sharpened. "That's exactly the point. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Carl dropped his gaze to the floor. "I made a mistake." Daniel studied him for a moment. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. And that choice showed me what kind of man wears this badge." Carl felt smaller with every word. He had never been scolded like this, not by the chief, not even by his father. The silence stretched until Daniel finally sighed. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, officer?" Carl's voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at him steadily, then nodded once. "We'll see if you mean that." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You'll be questioned officially later. For now, go home, and think about what your badge really means." Then he walked out, leaving Carl standing alone in the middle of the office. When Carl came out, every officer looked away. No one dared speak. He removed his cap, placed it on his desk, and walked out of the station without a word. The sound of his boots echoed down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the FBI agents were talking quietly near their vehicles. Daniel stood apart from them, speaking into his phone. He didn't even glance at Carl as he passed, but that silence cut deeper than anger. Carl's car felt miles away, and when he finally reached it, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the keys. He sat inside, staring through the windshield at the agents moving around the parking lot. For the first time, he saw how small his world was. His power, his pride, his little town, it all meant nothing here. These men didn't fear him. They didn't even notice him. As he drove home, every house, every streetlight felt different. The people he used to wave at now looked at him with suspicion. He realized something terrible. His uniform didn't make him respected anymore. It made him feared and now pitied. That night, Carl couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Daniel's voice in his head. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." He replayed the diner scene over and over. The laughter, the food dripping down, the quiet stare. Every detail burned like fire in his memory. He wanted to fix it, to apologize properly, but he didn't know how. What could he say to undo it? Nothing could. His whole life he thought strength came from power, but now he saw true strength sitting quietly in a diner, covered in food, still calm, still human. Outside his window, thunder rolled in the distance. Carl stared into the darkness, whispering to himself, "Tomorrow I'll make it right." But deep down he feared it was already too late, because in the morning the investigation would begin, and this time, the man he poured food on would be the one writing the report. The next morning, the police station didn't sound like a police station anymore. The usual laughter, the sound of typewriters, the smell of coffee, it was all gone. Instead, there was silence. A thick, heavy silence that made everyone walk slower, talk softer, and breathe carefully. The FBI had taken over. Black vehicles were parked outside like dark sentinels. Inside, agents in suits moved with quiet precision, setting up laptops, carrying folders, whispering to one another. Every officer felt smaller in their presence. Even the chief looked nervous as he spoke in low tones to Agent Daniel Brooks, the man whose name now spread across every corner of town. Carl sat alone at his desk, pretending to write something on a piece of paper. His badge lay beside him, shining under the light, but it no longer felt like pride. It felt like a mirror reflecting his mistake. His throat was dry. His hands trembled when he tried to hold his pen. He could feel every eye on him, every whisper in the air. "That's the one," someone murmured. "The one who dumped food on him." Around mid-morning, Daniel Brooks stepped out of the chief's office. His calm expression never changed. He carried a small notebook and a pen, his badge gleaming faintly in the sunlight coming through the window. Without raising his voice, he said, "We'll begin the interviews now." Every officer straightened in their seat. The first few hours were slow and silent. One by one, officers were called in. The door closed and whispers followed. Nobody knew what was being said, only that each officer came out looking pale, quiet, and tense. Some even avoided Carl's eyes completely. When Carl's name was finally called, his heart skipped a beat. He stood, legs heavy as iron, and walked to the door. Every step echoed in the silent room. When he entered, Agent Brooks was already seated behind the desk, his eyes calm, his posture straight. "Sit," he said. Carl sat, trying not to make noise. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of a clock ticking filled the room. Then Daniel looked up and said, "Officer Carl Peters, I want you to tell me everything that happened in the diner that day." Carl cleared his throat. "It was a joke. A stupid one." "I didn't mean," Daniel interrupted quietly. "A joke?" His tone was sharp but calm. "You poured hot food on a man's head in public. You called him names. You laughed. Tell me, officer, what was funny about it?" Carl's face turned red. "Nothing, sir," he whispered. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Then why did you do it?" Carl looked down at his hands. "I don't know. Maybe I was angry, maybe I thought he was just another nobody." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained cold. "You thought wrong." He tapped his pen on the table slowly. "Do you know why I didn't react that day?" "Why I didn't press charges immediately?" Carl looked up, confused. "No, sir," Daniel nodded. "Because I wanted to see how deep the problem goes. One man's cruelty tells a story, but silence from others tells me more. No one in that diner stopped you. No one in your department questioned you. You understand what that means?" Carl nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. It means this department doesn't just have one bad officer. It has a sickness, one that grows from arrogance and lack of empathy." The words hit Carl like stones. His chest tightened. "Sir, Daniel stopped him with a raised hand. "I don't need your excuses. I need your honesty. Do you regret it?" Carl swallowed hard. "Every second of it. I didn't know who you were. But that doesn't matter. I shouldn't have done it to anyone." For the first time, Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Good," he said, "because recognition is the first step. But understand this, Officer Peters. What you did will have consequences. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability." Carl nodded again, tears burning behind his eyes. "I'll take whatever comes, sir." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You will. But maybe you'll also learn." The interview ended. Carl stood to leave, but before he reached the door, Daniel spoke again. "Do you know what real power is, officer?" Carl turned slowly. Daniel's voice grew quieter, deeper. "It's not the gun or the badge or the fear you create. Real power is control. The ability to stand calm even when humiliated. That's something you never learned, but maybe now you will." Carl didn't reply. He just nodded and left the room. Outside, the other officers stared at him as he walked past. For once, there was no arrogance in his step. He looked tired, small, and broken. He sat back at his desk, head bowed. For the rest of the day, the sound of typing and quiet voices filled the station, but Carl didn't move. As the hours passed, more evidence came forward. Old complaints, ignored reports, body cam footage that never reached the chief's desk. The FBI collected everything. Some officers tried to defend themselves, others stayed silent. By evening, the whole department looked different. The walls that once held pride now held fear. When the sun began to set, Daniel Brooks walked out of the building. Report in hand, he stopped by the door, looking at the fading orange light outside. Carl watched him go through the glass window. For a moment, he thought of running after him, saying something, anything, but no words came. That night, as Carl drove home, the streets looked darker than ever. The same diner glowed in the distance. Through the window, he saw Mary, the waitress, cleaning the counter. She looked up and saw him too. Her eyes said everything: disappointment, pity, and a hint of forgiveness. He gave a weak nod and drove away. At home, Carl sat alone on his porch, staring at his badge. The metal no longer shined like before. It looked dull, almost lifeless. He whispered to himself, "Respect? That's all it takes." And somewhere across town, Daniel Brooks filed his report, writing one line at the end that no one else would see. He may yet learn what justice really means. The investigation had just begun, but the lesson, the real lesson, was already being written. 3 weeks passed, and the small town was no longer the same. The police station that once stood tall with pride now looked dull and silent. Reporters came and went. Headlines filled the local papers. Officer under federal scrutiny. FBI investigates town police conduct. Justice in uniform. Every shopkeeper, every passerby knew what had happened at the diner. Carl stopped wearing his uniform in public. Whenever he walked through town, people whispered. Children stared. Some laughed quietly. Others crossed the street. The badge that once made him feel powerful now felt like a curse hanging around his neck. He barely slept. Each night he saw the same scene, the bowl tipping, the laughter, and those calm, unshaken eyes watching him without hate. Just truth. Inside the station, the FBI had completed their inspection. Several officers were suspended for minor violations. Others were warned. But Carl's case was different. His humiliation of a federal agent had gone viral after a leaked security video spread online. Millions had seen it. Thousands commented. He deserved to lose his badge. Power without respect is nothing. That man's calm was legendary. The town mayor called for a public apology. The FBI agreed, and Agent Daniel Brooks approved it quietly without emotion. The day came on a gray afternoon. The town square filled with people. Reporters stood with microphones, their cameras pointed at the small stage set up in front of the courthouse. On the stage there were only 2 chairs, one for the chief and one for Officer Carl Peters. Carl stood behind the curtain, sweating, staring at his trembling hands. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes waiting. The chief came up beside him and whispered, "Keep it short. Keep it honest. You brought this on yourself, now face it." Then he walked away. Carl stepped onto the stage, and the noise of the crowd faded into a low hum. He looked out at the sea of faces, people he once joked with, people he once scared, now watching in silence. Cameras clicked. Microphones pointed. Somewhere near the front, Daniel Brooks stood with his arms crossed, calm as always. Carl cleared his throat. His voice cracked at first. 3 weeks ago, he began slowly, I did something unforgivable. I used my uniform not to protect, but to humiliate. I disrespected a man I didn't even know simply because I could. I thought power meant control. I thought respect could be demanded. But I was wrong. He paused, swallowing hard. The wind blew softly, tugging at his sleeve. That day in the diner, I poured food on a man who stayed calm when he had every right to fight back. That silence, it haunts me every night. Because that silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. The crowd stayed silent. Even the reporters lowered their microphones slightly. Carl looked toward Daniel. Their eyes met for the first time since the interview. Carl's voice steadied. Agent Brooks showed me something I never learned in all my years wearing this badge. That respect isn't about fear. It's about humanity. And without it, no uniform, no rank, no title means anything. He took a deep breath, his eyes glistening. To Agent Brooks, to this town, and to everyone watching, I'm sorry. Not just for the act, but for what it said about who I was. I will live with that shame, but I hope someday I can earn back even a fraction of the respect I lost. He stepped back, his voice trembling on the last word. The air stayed still. Then softly, people began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, just a few hands. But soon the sound spread, slow, measured applause that filled the square. Daniel Brooks didn't clap. He simply nodded once. That single gesture carried more weight than all the applause combined. Carl felt tears sting his eyes. After the speech, Carl stepped down from the stage. He didn't expect anyone to speak to him, but Daniel approached quietly. No cameras, no microphones, just 2 men standing face to face. You meant it? Daniel asked simply. Carl nodded. Every word. Daniel studied him for a moment, then said, Then start living like it. Carl swallowed hard. I want to make things right. Daniel's eyes softened slightly. Then teach others what you learned. That'll be your redemption. They shook hands, firm, silent, human. For the first time, Carl felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not pride, not power. Peace. As Daniel turned to leave, a reporter tried to ask him a question. He smiled faintly and said, No comment. The story speaks for itself. Then he walked away, disappearing into the quiet crowd. That evening, the video of the apology went viral. But what caught people's hearts wasn't Carl's words, it was the image of 2 men shaking hands. One in a uniform, one in a suit. Opposites in every way, yet equal in that single moment. Across the country, people shared the video with captions like, Real justice doesn't always punish, it teaches, and respect doesn't need a badge. For the first time in months, Carl slept peacefully that night. He didn't dream of humiliation or fear. He dreamed of a quiet diner, where a man sat alone and calm, teaching him more in silence than words ever could. After the public apology, life in the small town began to change, but quietly, almost like the wind shifting direction. The tension that once filled the air started to fade, replaced by something softer. People spoke a little more kindly to each other. The diner, where everything began, started to fill again with laughter, though everyone remembered the lesson burned into its walls. Carl kept working at the station, but differently. He was quieter now, humbler. He greeted everyone with respect, from janitor to clerk. He no longer barked orders or raised his voice. When new recruits arrived, he helped them with paperwork, taught them procedures, and reminded them, never forget who you're talking to. Every person has a story you don't see. But even as the town tried to move on, one name still hung in every conversation: Agent Daniel Brooks. The man who had changed everything. No one knew much about him. He wasn't the kind of man who gave interviews or appeared on talk shows. He left town a few days after the apology, quietly, just as he had arrived. But curiosity spread like wildfire. Who was this man who could forgive the very person who humiliated him in public? Why had he been so calm that day? A week later, the local newspaper decided to find out. Reporter Linda Hayes spent 3 days digging through archives, government databases, and old reports. What she discovered shocked everyone. Daniel Brooks wasn't just another FBI agent. He was one of the youngest agents ever promoted to lead federal investigations in the region. He'd solved several high-profile corruption cases across 3 states. But that wasn't what caught Linda's attention. It was something deeper, something personal. 10 years earlier, before joining the Bureau, Daniel had been a small-town police officer himself, in a town not much different from this one. Back then, he'd faced the same kind of prejudice he now investigated. He'd been mocked, overlooked, and even suspended once because he reported a senior officer for misconduct. Instead of quitting, he studied harder, joined the academy, and rose through the ranks to become one of the Bureau's best internal investigators. When the paper published his story, it spread across the state. The headline read, "The man who stayed silent, FBI agent's past reveals why he never fought back." People were stunned. It made sense now, the way he looked at Carl that day, the way he didn't shout or retaliate. He had lived that moment before. He knew exactly what kind of man Carl was then, because once he had faced men just like him. But instead of becoming bitter, he had chosen a different path. When Carl read the article, he sat quietly at his desk, staring at the paper for a long time. The image of Daniel in uniform, years younger, smiling proudly, hit him harder than any investigation ever could. He whispered to himself, "He could have hated me," but he didn't. Later that week, Carl visited the diner again. Mary, the waitress, smiled faintly when she saw him. "You look different," she said. Carl smiled weakly. "I feel different." He sat at the same table where Daniel once sat. The seat across from him was empty, but it didn't feel that way. He could almost see him there. The calm eyes, the quiet strength, the unspoken message. Mary walked over, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "You know," she said softly, "that man changed more than just you. People talk to each other differently now. They think before they act." "That's rare," Carl nodded slowly. "He taught us all something without saying much." Outside, a little boy ran past the diner window wearing a plastic badge, pretending to be a cop. His mother called after him, laughing. Carl watched and smiled sadly. He hoped that kid would grow up in a world where respect wasn't something you demanded, but something you earned. That evening, Carl returned to the station and opened his locker. Inside was his old cap, a small folded note resting on top. It wasn't there before. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat and simple. "Forgiveness is not weakness. It's the beginning of change." DB, Carl's throat tightened. He didn't know how the note got there, but he didn't care. He tucked it inside his pocket, close to his heart. From that day on, Carl made a promise to serve with integrity, to never judge, and to remember the man who showed him what true authority looked like. Months later, he was invited to a regional police seminar to speak about ethics and behavior in uniform. Standing before the crowd, Carl took a deep breath and began. "I once thought power came from fear. Then I met a man who taught me that true power comes from calm." The audience listened, silent as he shared his story, not to seek sympathy, but to pass on the lesson. By the end of his talk, people stood and clapped. Some even wiped their eyes. For the first time in a long time, Carl felt proud again, not of his badge, but of who he was becoming. As he walked off the stage, he saw a familiar figure at the back of the room. Daniel Brooks, dressed casually, no suit, no badge, just a man, watching quietly with a small, approving smile. Their eyes met across the crowd. No words, just understanding. Carl nodded respectfully, and Daniel nodded back before turning to leave. The doors closed behind him, and Carl knew he might never see him again. But that was okay, because some people don't stay in your life to be remembered. They stay long enough to change it forever.